وخلال أقل من أسبوع تم زراعة عشرات أشجار الغاف والتي ما زالت موجودة اليوم.
تاريخياً في دولة الإمارات كان فن العمارة يعتمد على الاستدامة ومبني على الاستدامة. كيف نحن نستخدم اتجاه الرياح، اتجاه الهواء، كيف نستخدم مواد البناء اللي من الطبيعة، كيف نحن نحافظ على التبريد داخل المنزل عن طريق تصميم الواجهات بشكل مبني على هذه العناصر الطبيعية.
دولة الإمارات وضعت بصمتها على الساحة العالمية وأثبتت وجودها كأحدى الدول المتقدمة في مجالات كثيرة ومنها الاستدامة والتنمية الحضرية.
نحن اليوم في مدينة مصدر، مدينة مصدر قصة نجاح يطلع لها العالم في الوصول لحلول لتحدي من أكبر التحديات، وهو تحدي البنية التحتية. كيف نحن ممكن المباني والمدن تكون مدننا صديقة للبيئة، فهذه المدينة اليوم صارت مثل عالمي.
الحمد لله دولة الإمارات تعتبر من الدول الرائدة بإيجاد طرق بديلة لإنتاج الطاقة من خلال الألواح الشمسية المختلفة، واليوم دولة الإمارات تصدر التقنية هذه لدول العالم المختلفة.
نحن اليوم قاعدين نشوف مشاريعنا قاعدة تترجم لاستراتيجيات عالمية. الإرث اللي تركها لنا الشيخ زايد الله يرحمه ويغفر له كان مبني على الاستدامة والوعي البيئي. الصورة اللي دائما نحن نتذكرها صورة المرحوم وهو يسقي الزرع بإيده، وهو قاعد بكل تواضع على الأرض يوصي بأهمية الأرض وبأهمية رعاية البيئة وحفاظ عليها للمستقبل. نحن اليوم نجني هاي الثمار، نجري ثمار هذا الوعي اللي كان مش بس فكر، كان فكر وترجم لعمل.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. سمو الشيخ خالد بن زايد آل نهيان، رئيس مجلس إدارة مؤسسة زايد العليا لأصحاب الهمم، سمو الشيوخ أصحاب المعالي والسعادة، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. يسرنا أن نرحب بكم في مجلس محمد بن زايد، المنبر الذي يؤسس قاعدة معرفية مؤثرة في طريقنا نحو مستقبل أكثر إشراقاً. واسمحوا لي بداية أن أعرف بنفسي. أنا أخوكم سعود محمد النوري، مدير إدارة آسيا والشرق الأوسط في كوب 28، ويشرفني اليوم أن أتولى مهمة إدارة هذا الحوار. نستضيف اليوم السيد مايكل بولن، مهندس معماري معروف بعمله في مجال الهندسة المعمارية والابتكارات التي تحاكي الطبيعة، لتقديم محاضرة بعنوان حلول مستوحاة من الطبيعة من أجل مستقبل مستدام، وسيعرض من خلالها رؤيته وأفكاره في هذا المجال. ونلفت عنايتكم إلى أن المحاضرة ستكون باللغة الإنجليزية، وبإمكانكم استخدام السماعات لمتابعة الترجمة الفورية. واسمحوا لي الآن أن أتحدث باللغة الإنجليزية. Your Highnesses, Excellencies, Ladies and Gentlemen, I am honored to moderate today's session, which delves into the realm of adopting nature-inspired methodologies to design cities, buildings, and infrastructure. These innovative approaches aim to achieve a seamless integration into our environment and to enhancing human well-being above unprecedented levels. Our guest speaker today is Michael Pollan, a renowned architect recognized for his groundbreaking contributions to the realm of biomimetic architecture and innovation. His focus is on high-performance buildings and solutions for the circular economy. He has been providing advice to governments and large entities on transformative change. I would now like to welcome Mr. Michael Pollan to begin his lecture.
Your Highnesses, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for this opportunity. It's an honor to be here. The short version of what I'm going to say is that conventional sustainability has not got us to where we need to be. And we need to move to the next level inspired by nature. And I'm going to make the case that this is going to involve rethinking what it means to be human. And I want to start with a perspective which I think is helpful in explaining that we're really at quite a critical moment in history. It's often said that the first photograph of the Earth taken from the moon, the so-called Earthrise photo, is what kick-started the environmental movement in the late 1960s and 1970s. In many ways, I find this image much more compelling. This was taken by the Cassini spacecraft. As it passed Jupiter, it turned around and it took this photograph of planet Earth, that little pale blue dot. And I think it's clear from that that no one is coming to our rescue. Whatever happens is up to us. And this makes me think about our place in the cosmos and our place in deep time. The writer Janine Benyus has a very good way of capturing the idea of deep time. She encourages us to imagine as if the whole history of planet Earth were represented as a single calendar year. And imagine that you were standing a breath before midnight on New Year's Eve and you're looking back over that year. What you'd find is that the first life forms appeared in March, the dinosaurs appeared in early December and disappeared on the 26th of December. The first hominids appeared at 8 p.m. today, the 31st of December. The whole of recorded history has flashed past in the last 30 seconds. In the last 2 seconds, humans became a geophysical force altering our whole climate. In the last third of a second, that's equivalent to 60 years, we've extinguished more than 2/3 of the wild animal biomass on Earth, and we've gone 2/3 of the way to becoming sterile as a species. So from this perspective, it'd be easy to conclude that we're racing towards extinction. I don't think that's inevitable, but if we carry on in the direction we're going, we are heading for deep trouble. Some people might try to persuade you that technology has all the solutions, and I don't believe that's the case. I think technology has a lot of the answers, but technology alone will not rescue us. I believe we actually need to move to the next level in our human evolution. So conventional sustainability has often been about trying to be a bit less bad, trying to use a bit less energy, trying to be a bit more efficient, trying to produce less waste. And I think growing numbers of people are realizing that that's not enough. That has not got us onto a safe pathway for humanity. And we actually need to start making buildings that are net positive, buildings that take more carbon out of the atmosphere than they emit, that generate more clean energy than they use, buildings that filter the air and harvest water and create habitats for wildlife. That's what it means to go beyond less bad into the realm of having a net positive impact. And I think this new role for humans is going to require us to rethink our connection with nature, to rethink our ideas about time, and to think deeply about the pool of ideas that we draw from. Currently, our economies mostly treat nature as something separate from us, as something that can be plundered for resources. And we need to overcome that separation to become good stewards of nature, to repair the damage we've done, and see ourselves as actually an evolving part of nature. With regard to time, we've got used to thinking in rather short timescales, and we need to expand that to become good ancestors and think over much longer timescales. In the modern age, we've often forgotten about some of the really important indigenous and traditional ideas that existed before the modern age. And we need to reawaken that kind of ingenuity. Humans are a very ingenious species, and we need to learn from our whole history of ingenuity. So I'm going to show some examples of projects that I hope will explain what I mean by this kind of thinking. Recent science has started to challenge our ideas about us as human individuals. So I'm thinking particularly of what's called the Human Microbiome Project. It's quite a startling fact to know that our human cells are outnumbered 10 to 1 by microbial cells within our bodies, this is. And all of those cells, the human and the microbial cells, they're all dependent on other living systems for the essentials of life, for oxygen, water, and nutrients. So we can see that our ideas about separation are not what we once thought. We are very much part of nature, and we are dependent on nature. How do we overcome this idea of separation? Well, there's a lot that we can learn from looking at the way that life has evolved on planet Earth. And this can help us to radically rethink the way we do things. And when I'm using that word radically, I mean in the quite literal sense of the term. So trying to really get to the root of the issue. So if we were to look at how life works, we find that 96% of all living matter is made from just 4 elements: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Of the remaining 4%, that's nearly all a further 7 elements. So you can see that nature uses a very limited and safe subset of the periodic table and has evolved to make really amazing high-performance materials, equal, or in some cases superior to our own. It's evolved to assemble these in incredibly beautiful and efficient ways. This is a table that my studio designed for an exhibition, and it's based on a functional understanding of growth patterns in bones and trees. And it's trying to get as close as possible to a theoretically perfect structure. And what I mean by that is it's trying to put the materials in exactly the right place so we achieve optimum efficiency. It's also made from biologically derived materials, so that's taken carbon out of the atmosphere, and it's 3D printed. Now, I mentioned a few minutes ago that I'm not convinced technology has all the answers. And I think 3D printing is a good example of what I mean. So the outcome of any particular technology depends a lot on the mindset behind it. So within a conventional mindset of sustainability, 3D printing could easily see us drowning in millions of tons of short-life consumer goods and a lot of waste. But within a nature-inspired mindset, it could be transformative. It could allow us to use exactly the right elements and assemble them in the most efficient, beautiful ways. The next project I want to talk about is one that I jointly initiated. It's called the Sahara Forest Project. And I talked about this in my TED talk quite a bit. So today I want to focus specifically on the ways in which this was going beyond less bad into the realms of having a net positive impact. The starting point was a realization that a lot of the world's deserts were actually vegetated quite a short time ago. When Julius Caesar arrived in North Africa, he found this wooded landscape of cedar trees and cypress trees. His armies cleared those to create farms and really started a degenerative cycle. So deforestation led to less humidity led to less rainfall, and less rainfall led to further deforestation, all the while reducing the fertility of the soil. And the main idea with this project is that it brings together a number of technologies that work better together than by themselves. So I'm talking principally about forms of solar energy, desert revegetation techniques, and a type of greenhouse that is based on a desert beetle that has evolved to harvest its own fresh water in a desert. You might wonder why we would want to do this in a desert. Why would we want to grow food in a desert? And there are 2 reasons. Firstly, there's a huge amount of solar energy available in a desert. And the second is that we really can't afford to be losing agricultural land to desertification. This study shows the connection between food prices and the likelihood of civil unrest. So these are all the instances of civil unrest. And then this is what the food price index was doing at the time. And you can see that there's a very close link. So when the food price index rises above a certain point, it makes civil unrest far more likely to occur. So let's talk about some solutions. This is a version of the Sahara Forest Project that we created in Qatar. So we had those 3 core technologies and actually a number of others. We had other types of solar energy. We were experimenting with desert revegetation. The greenhouse in the middle is the one inspired by the beetle. We have crops growing in seawater. Towards the right, we have algae for biofuels, and at the back, we have salt processing. And I really think this could help countries in hot, dry parts of the world improve their food security, because we managed to grow crops throughout the summer months in Qatar with half the amount of fresh water of conventional approaches. And we used this prototype to help refine the technologies so that we could really optimize the whole system. And we also wanted to explore the extent to which this was having a positive impact on the site. So at the start, it was just desert, dry, bone-dry desert. And this infographic shows what we achieved. So we made a note of the birds, mammals, and insects that appeared on the site. So the first things to appear were flies, nothing particularly interesting there. But then literally the same day that we've brought the first plants to site, we had the first birds appearing. And very soon after that, we had the first insects, grasshoppers, crickets, and a month later, we had the first butterflies. And bear in mind, this was quite a long way from the nearest patch of planting. Then, as the plants got more established, we had other types of birds, wagtails, we were getting more insects. Then we had a bit of a problem with rats, but still we were getting more birds and insects, which was nice. Then we had mice to deal with as well, which was a bit of a pain, but still we were getting more birds and insects. And then 3 days after the algae ponds were filled, we had the first dragonflies. And again, I don't know where they came from, because this was a long way from the nearest dragonfly habitat. And it seems that nature does have this amazing capacity to regenerate if you can just create the right conditions. And then we had an appearance from a feral cat, which was quite handy because the number of rats and mice started going down. More birds, more insects. We had an appearance from a hoopoe, not often seen in Qatar. Then we had one called a rufous-tailed shrike. We had other types of wagtails and rock thrushes. And eventually, we had the first indigenous mammal, a little jerboa. It's like a little hopping kangaroo that leaves very distinctive tracks. All of that was achieved in just 8 months on a site 100 meters by 100 meters. And I'm convinced that if we were to do that over a longer time scale and on a bigger physical scale, that regenerative effect would be even more pronounced. So instead of the downward spiral of desertification that we saw in North Africa, we could see an upward spiral, from aridity to abundance, from barren to bursting with new life. Learning from nature shows how we can create food and energy while revegetating deserts. And this is part of the new role that I think we need to evolve into as humans. So we've looked at a nature-inspired approach to materials and landscapes. Now let's look at infrastructure. A few years ago, I was asked to join a tender for a large new water treatment facility. And part of the tender was that this was going to be judged on 10 years running costs. So there was a very good case for making this as energy efficient as possible. And when I looked at other examples of water treatment facilities, they seemed to me to be very rectilinear, very straight lines, a lot of space between the elements. And I wondered what we might learn from nature to help us rethink this. This image of a leaf shows a phenomenon that's referred to in nature as Murray's law. So there's a very precise ratio between the diameter of those vessels. There's also a very constant angle at which that branching occurs. And then there's a certain finessing of those junctions. That's an evolved minimum energy solution for how to get gases and liquids around plants and animals. So we thought we'd have a go at exploring the same idea. And this shows just a hypothetical layout. So the white circles are bits of equipment, and then the colored pipes are pipes that connect them. And this digital design tool is based on those nature's flow principles. So it works out the optimum relative positioning and the optimum branching angle. And if you look at the figure in the bottom left, you can see that the total length of pipework came down from 100 to just below 64. So that's a big saving. What we did next is that we looked at a very realistic version of a wastewater treatment plant. So this has all the right elements in the right sequence. And this time we combined the figure for length and angle to create a figure for total equivalent length. And what I mean by that is when you add a bend to a system, it's quite well known in engineering terms how much friction that adds to the system. So that figure is a very good measure of how much energy it's going to use. And you can see that by following nature's flow principles, we came down from 100 to below 40 in terms of the equivalent length. It shows just how much energy we could save when we're treating wastewater if we learn from nature. At the beginning, I mentioned that I think it's important that we reawaken some of the ingenuity and traditional ideas that existed before the modern age. And you know, a lot of modern architecture, I think, turned its back on the traditional ideas, partly perhaps because it was so easy to burn fossil fuels to meet all our needs. But I think one of the most exciting things about the age we're entering is that we're going to see a reawakening of that ingenuity. And combining human ingenuity with the best solutions that nature has to offer, that is a very fertile combination. So one of the key sources of ideas here was actually a camel's nose. If you were to take a section through a camel's nose, you find it has these very intricate passageways. They're called nasal turbinates. And they have a lot of blood vessels in them. And what that means is when the camel breathes in the dry desert air, those surfaces evaporate water into the air, so it's cooled and humidified, and it's less of a shock to the system. When the camel breathes out, that warm, humid air passes those same surfaces, which are cool, and so a lot of that moisture recondenses and is captured by the camel. The small amount of water that it loses, it gets evaporative cooling benefits from that, so it can keep its brain and eyeballs as much as 6 degrees C cooler than the rest of its body. And the reason this was interesting is because our client had asked us to create a building that did something interesting with water. So this was an important source of ideas. The other key idea came from the traditional Middle Eastern art of ice making. Now, I expect many of you have heard of this before, but for those of you who aren't familiar, I have a sketch here which explains how this worked. So let's look at some comparative temperatures, and let's just imagine the temperature of the desert at night. Let's say that was about 30 degrees C, which is quite cozy. The temperature of outer space is minus 273 degrees C, which is a bit chilly. And you can get a matte black surface to radiate heat to outer space and lose heat. And so what they used to do traditionally is they would put a ceramic tray on a bed of straw for insulation. There would be a black glaze on that ceramic tray and a thin layer of water that they'd put out just after nightfall. And on a clear night, that radiative effect out to outer space was enough to turn that water into ice. Before sunrise, they would collect that and store it for later use. And for me, this has so much more beauty and ingenuity than the fully glazed, fully air-conditioned office buildings designed by modern architects. So how do we turn this into an idea for a building? Well, the main thing was a clever roof based on the ice-making ideas. So during the day, we had sun shading, which would keep the heat off it. And then at night, we would open those to open that pathway, that radiation pathway to the night sky. And that would make the underside of the roof quite cool. And when you cool humid air, moisture condenses on any available surface. And then we created maximum surface area with these kind of fins inspired by the camel's nostrils. And then we applied a special mesh to those, which has been designed to optimize water collection. So this was a powerful water collection device. And in terms of the form of the building, we didn't really want the air near the ground because that would be picking up heat from the ground. We wanted the air slightly higher up. And that suggested some kind of wind scoop. We were also told that this building might have to form an archway to another building behind it. So the combination of an archway and this kind of wind scoop led us to develop a form a bit like a Pringle, like this. And the whole of that roof surface would have this ice maker camel's nostril collection on the underside. We would sit this above a landscaped auditorium, and then the water would run down to a central hole, a channel around that. And when you're ready for the concert to start, you could have a theatrical shower of rain around the stage, which would tell people that the music is about to start. And this is a further sketch showing what I was talking about. So this would be like a concert venue within an oasis garden. All the plants would be from the Middle East region. And this would be a roof that would be harvesting all its own water to create this oasis. So generating water to regenerate oasis plants. The final project I'm going to talk about is one that takes its inspiration from nature's cycles of time, particularly the cycles of the moon. And it's interesting to note that there are 28 phases of the moon and 28 references to the moon in the Quran. There are also several references to the moon as a marker of time. And we discovered some other quite remarkable things about the moon. So it turns out that the moon is exactly 108 moon diameters from Earth. The sun is exactly 108 sun diameters from the Earth. And the sun is 108 Earth diameters across. Quite remarkable. And that number 108, you find that cropping up in other examples. So that's the internal angle in a pentagon. And if you overlay further pentagons on that, you find that this dimension is relative to this dimension, which is 1.618. And that's the golden ratio, a golden proportion which you find throughout the natural world. Another element of this project was these amazing solar power installations. I've been fascinated by these. I just think they're such a heroic symbol of the world that we need to create. So our idea was to create a pentagon of these solar power plants and then to have the moonlit theatre in the middle. So the idea is to create a theatre that is lit entirely by moonlight, using mirrors to focus the moonlight when it's the full moon. The stage is exactly 108 stage diameters from the entrance. You can only get to this on foot. And then this model shows the mirrors arranged around the back of the auditorium, focusing light onto the stage. So this would use no energy apart from the human energy involved in just focusing those mirrors. And the idea is that this would inspire people to think about deep time, to think deeply about how they want to use their precious time on Earth. And to conclude, I want to return to this idea I've mentioned several times of humans moving to the next stage in our evolution. And you can see over time, humans have developed through several distinct stages of consciousness, from individualistic to tribal to traditional, modern, and postmodern. And within that, you can see that we moved from having national perspectives to international to global perspectives. In the modern age, that was very much an age of consumerism, where we often forgot about certain important traditional ideas. It soon became apparent that there were some flaws with that worldview, and that led to the postmodern age of conscious consumerism. The idea, and I include sustainability in this, the idea that we can save the planet by designing buildings to minimize their impact, or choosing what we buy more carefully. Now, I think we need to go much further than that. We actually need to be much more ambitious and move to the next stage in our evolution, which I would call the integral stage. And this is a stage that looks back on all the previous stages and draws out the best from them. So rather than just looking at 100 years of human knowledge, this would draw on 100,000 years of human ingenuity, combined with 3.8 billion years of evolutionary refinement in nature. And I think this is going to involve an expansion of perspectives in a number of ways. Firstly, we need to expand from a global perspective to a planetary perspective. What I mean by that is seeing that our well-being is inseparable from the well-being of the living systems that support us, that provide the essentials of life. I think we also need to question the idea of conscious consumerism, because it's clear that that hasn't got us to where we need to be. And I think in the way we think of ourselves as humans, we need to move to what I would call possibilist thinking. And that's very different to optimism or pessimism. So optimism and pessimism imply some sense of inevitability about the future, and you either feel positive or negative about that. But that implies that the future is something that happens to us. And the idea with possibilism is that a possibilist decides on the future they want and then sets about creating that, maximizing their influence and collaborating with others to create a positive future. So we need to be engaging in much longer-term thinking, rather than just the next quarterly business cycle or the next political term of office. We need to be thinking at least 7 generations into the future. And I'd like to suggest that we're not just wealth creators. Our children won't thank us for that, particularly if it's at the expense of their future. We're capable of so much more than that. As urgently as possible, we need to reach the point where we have integrated everything we do into the web of life that supports us. We need to rise to a new role as co-enablers of the flourishing of all life for all time. And if you doubt that humans are capable of reaching this point of having a net positive impact, then look at the difference that a single pair of beavers made to a fire-ravaged landscape. We humans, we're ingenious. We ought to be able to do the same. And if you doubt that we can do this on a large scale, then look at what was achieved in the lowest plateau in China. 3,000 square kilometers of barren desert restored to biodiversity. And if you feel daunted by the idea of human transformation, then look at the prize that's on offer. We could be the first generation to witness the great return, the return of flora and fauna to our forests, the return of salmon runs to our rivers, the return of wildlife to the desert, and a rewilding of the human spirit. All of that is within our reach if we take on a new role as co-enablers of the flourishing of all life for all time. Thank you.
I found that very fascinating, especially when you linked the fact that we need to start rethinking how we think about being human. I have a couple of questions, if you don't mind.
Please.
You said that efficiency is something that we need to strive for and to look at very seriously. But sometimes when we look at efficiency, it is something that's always associated with a heavy cost. Do you think that we can push for efficiency while being cost effective?
I do, yes. So there was a project that I was involved with called the Eden Project in the UK. It's this large botanical enclosure. And we used inspiration from nature to rethink that structure. And by doing that, we were able to design something that was a third of the weight and about a third of the cost and a fraction of the weight. And so often, taking inspiration from nature, we can achieve something that's far more efficient. Sometimes it's much cheaper at the beginning. Sometimes it's a little bit more expensive at the start to build it, but then it pays back very quickly through reduced running costs.
Okay, given your experience in the field, what do you think of the major challenges you face into implementing the work that you do?
Well, in the UK, a lot of clients still have a rather short-term perspective. And so some of these ideas do take a bit longer to pay back. And as one example of that, it's actually a project we did in India. It was a textiles factory. And textiles is an incredibly energy and water-intensive industry. We showed that we could design a completely zero-carbon building that was almost closed loop with water and zero waste. It would have a payback period of about 5 or 6 years. And from that point on, it would be much cheaper and it would be more resilient against changes in legislation. But unfortunately, the economics were judged to be not good enough. And that is quite frustrating. I think we do need to get over that somehow. We need to be able to take a longer-term perspective.
You mentioned that buildings should have more than just a presence. There should be multifunctional and they have a purpose. What do you think of, the impacts of climate change? How does that impact how we start thinking about buildings?
Well, I think there are two important ways. One is that we need to design buildings so that we're not just limiting the extent to which they're contributing to climate change, but they're actually reversing that. That's one aspect. And the other aspect is that whatever we do, we know there is going to be a certain amount of climate change. Even if we were to stop emitting all carbon today, there's a certain amount of climate change that's locked in. So we need to be designing for climate resilience, designing our cities so that we have more shading around buildings to cope with hotter summers, designing water collection systems so they make use of more intensive rainfall without causing flooding, essentially anticipating the kind of climatic changes that we're going to be getting and designing solutions for that. And there are some excellent examples that we can turn to in nature. So one of the consultants that I've worked with was asked to design a small city in part of India, which had astonishing rainfall, something like 11 meters of rain a year. Nearly all of, well, most of that fell just within the rainy season. And so what they did is that they, as a design team, they looked at how the natural ecosystem coped with that amount of water, with hardly any flooding. And from that, they took inspiration to design the buildings in a way that was similar, that would absorb a lot of water, that would intercept water in various ways before it was discharged into rivers.
This last question is some personal question from my side. I read that you lived in Japan, and this is something that you and I have in common. How do you feel your time in Japan actually influenced the way you approach sustainable architecture?
Well, I found it really useful spending a year in another culture and absorbing, sort of immersing myself in that culture so that when I came back to the UK, I was able to look at it much more objectively. That's one thing. But more specifically on your point about sustainability, I think I learned a lot about the beauty of natural materials and the beauty of how to design a building into a landscape and achieve a really sort of seamless integration. I think it's one thing that the Japanese do particularly well. There's a particular sensitivity to the way they set their buildings into the landscape.
I agree with you, and I think the time I spent there really reflected how they can integrate someone into the way that they approach nature and how they feel about it. Thank you for answering my questions. في الختام، تناولت محاضرة اليوم الحاجة إلى السعي نحو مستوى جديد في مجال الاستدامة وصياغة مستقبل إيجابي حقيقي. من خلال الاستلهام من الطبيعة، ووجهت المحاضرة دعوة ملهمة للعمل بشكل جماعي لإحداث تأثير إيجابي ملموس في مجال الاستدامة من أجلنا ومن أجل أوطاننا ومن أجل كوكبنا. نتقدم بالشكر لمتحدثنا مايكل بولن على محاضرته القيمة والرد على الأسئلة المطروحة، وأشكر أيضا الحضور الكريم على حسن الاستماع. في الختام أود أن أدعو سمو الشيخ خالد بن زايد آل نهيان والمشاركين في مقطع الفيديو للتقدم لأخذ صورة جماعية، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
من جزر أبو ظبي كانت البداية، واللي لينا الحين قاعدين نعيش من خيرها. أبو ظبي وجزرها عطتنا الأمان، عطتنا الماء، عطتنا الصيد، يعني عطتنا الحياة. معالم قديمة بتسمعون عنها وبتعرفون تاريخها.
الجزر الليلة 7:30 مساء على قناة الإمارات.
شو راحت الماكينة؟ جيب سكين بسرعة.
غير خيوط فعلا يا ريال.
ها صوت الكنعدة.
خذ ماكينة واحدة ولك نثار يا أحمد.
تحدي الكنعد الاثنين 7 مساء على قناة الإمارات.
الإحساس موجة، مشاعرنا موجة، وعلاقاتنا بمنحولنا موجة. موجة تاخذك للبر، وموجة ببعض الأحيان مش واضحة وجهتها. وبين الموجة والثانية يمكن تكون موجتك موجودة. كل مدينة لها أمواجها بناسها، عاداتها، أفكارها، والأهم تجاربها الملهمة. أبو ظبي كم موجة وموجة وألف قصة فيها. ببرنامج موجات نسمع صوت هدير قصص كثيرة تأكد لنا أن الحياة أبسط وأسهل. الحياة موجة.
موجات الأربعاء 7:30 مساء على قناة أبو ظبي.